We are pleased to be joined by our first guest on this podcast, Nicole Auerbach, good friend of mine, senior national college football writer for The Athletic, Sirius XM host, Big Ten Network contributor, also National Sports Writer of the Year. Nicole, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing better after that introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, you got to give you the long intro because you got all the accolades.
So many jobs, too many jobs.
Well, I'm in the same boat. I can appreciate that. We're glad to have you. Obviously, through last year, I think you proved that you're one of the most locked in people when it comes to college football, specifically the Big Ten. So it's good to get some of your perspective, and I'll dive right into it on this alliance deal. And I know you were a part of the press conference, got to ask a question or two there, but what do you make of this alliance that the Big Ten, Pac-12, and ACC have formed?
I think it's interesting. I think there's been two schools of thought, right? One is that it's a whole bunch of nothing. And what does it mean if there's no signed contracts? And I think the other school of thought is, well, let's see what they're able to do behind the scenes. And I think we're going to get a first glimpse at that in the next month. There's a meeting in Chicago at the end of September about the college football playoff, the board of managers, the presidents, and the commissioners who run this thing. If this group is able to delay playoff expansion, that's a tangible result of the alliance. That's a tangible reason that this is doing something. So you have that, you have the NCAA is revising its model. Again, these aren't the most exciting things. Now, everyone wanted scheduling announcements. Everyone wanted to hear about, Michigan's playing Clemson or whatever, right? But those are behind the scenes, like very macro things that are tangible and could be significant in the future of college sports. So that's where I'm interested in it. And I think a lot of people have been a little bit distracted in the scheduling. And like the way that multiple people have described it to me is 80% governance, CFP, that type of stuff, 20% scheduling. What I think will be cool, though, is if the scheduling piece looks like I think it's going to, or what at least people are talking about it possibly looking like, you would go down to 8 conference games in the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, and then you'd play an ACC team and a Pac-12 team every year. So you'd have one of them at home. That would be really cool. And so, again, that's just one of the possibilities being discussed, but I love that idea. That would really strengthen whatever this is. But I also think even from just a governance standpoint, there are going to be real results where we'll see, are they actually going to vote as a block on certain things, or, will competing interests essentially overrule that? But I think it's important. I think it's important to provide a checks and balances system for the SEC, especially with new commissioners, especially on the heels of Oklahoma and Texas and playoff expansion. Someone needed to do something. And so I think it makes sense what they proposed. And now it's just the time to see, again, over the first month and then, months to come, like what it actually looks like in practice. But I like the idea of providing a checks and balances.
Yeah. So I think my question would be is like, you were talking about the timing of all this and kind of the fluidity of, and like backdoor handshakes of all of these alliances. Like, I think, what I'm interested to see is what your opinion is in terms of like what's next. Like, what does the timing now look like in terms of that expansion? What does the timing of maybe soliding up and contractually figuring out that alliance in terms of how they're going to do it and what that looks like and the impact that has then on the rest of college football? I think listening to you, obviously you're really well versed in it, and I would be interested to see a little bit more of like your opinion, deep dive into exactly what that means and the timing and where you see it going and the direction you see it going.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to see the Big Ten and the Pac-12 figure out the conference games standpoint. If they're able to drop it to 8 for as soon as, like, let's say next season, then you can add those games really soon. And I think you could also possibly buy out some of the non-conference games that exist between now and like 2025. Because I think Michigan is fully booked between now and then. But again, if you drop a conference game, you add a Saturday and you can do this. So I would love to see the scheduling piece start next season. I don't know if that's fully viable, like in terms of all the schools, but maybe you could say like 5 or 6 are going to start the alliance and start these games. So I think that that's going to be something. I do think that they are going to try to work as a voting block. I think that means when the NCAA gets revamped and revised, I think that they're going to try to figure out ways to, and maybe it's just as 3 conferences, but maybe they decide we're going to change the scholarship limits in baseball and like some of the other sports, and we can afford it. So we're going to do that. So I think you're going to see little things like that. I do think the playoff expansion will be delayed. I think it probably, if you're doing this from like a dollars and cents standpoint, it should be delayed to 2026 because that's when you're going to get the most money. But I think it all kind of speaks to me, like all of these situations, including Oklahoma and Texas and everything that's happened over the last month and a half, it speaks to like ESPN's influence on the sport.
Yep.
And I feel like that's one layer to this that people aren't talking about because they do broadcast and own so much of this sport. But that's something like when I think about this personally, in my opinion on it, I think this exposes that. And I think that it becomes pretty apparent, again, the idea of expanding the playoff, but letting ESPN broadcast the whole thing when you're adding 3 times the amount of games, like that's an issue. And you wouldn't want to do that if you have other Fox and NBC and CBS and all these other people who might want to get involved. But this is the sport that they own and they broadcast. And when we talk about, like, Joshua, we've had so many conversations about like the playoff prism that the only way to be successful in college football these days is to make the playoff. And it wasn't even enough for Notre Dame last year because Brian Kelly's still telling everyone to, don't jump off a ledge because we lost in the playoff. Like, right. All of that is ESPN's creation. So that's one of the things that I continually dwell on and think about is, how do you offset that? Because I don't think that's the healthiest thing for the sport. And I also don't think it's the healthiest thing for the SEC to consolidate power in the Southeast. So like, that's why, like, when I'm going to give benefit of the doubt to the alliance, because I think it's important to have somebody pushing back on the SEC.
I do want to get your opinion then. Like, what do you think happens to those smaller sub-conference teams now that you're starting to see the bigger conferences position themselves to where it's going to be like the SEC and then the Big Ten, the Pac-12 and the ACC, they're going to try to trim the fat of their schedules to be able to buff it up and be able to compete with a schedule that somebody who plays in the SEC does from a strength of schedule standpoint and what that means for playoffs and things of that nature moving forward. So like, what do you think happens with these smaller teams? How do we handle that? And how do you think, I personally think the NCAA is going to try to get involved with that at some level just to keep relevance. But what do you think happens with those programs?
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question because, if you are blocking off more Saturdays for people's schedule, you make it impossible to schedule that way. And there's a lot of reasons that people schedule those games. Again, you mentioned like kind of the health of the sport in those programs, like the money that those schools get for playing those games is a big deal. It like props up the entire athletic department. And that's why you see a lot of like the Michigans of the world will schedule like the directional schools because the money stays in state. Like it's really helpful. And there's alumni bases, like there's a lot of reasons that people do this. There's coaches obviously who are worried about job security or reaching a bowl game. Like there's reasons that people schedule those games. And I think that is a real concern. It was a concern when the Big Ten and the Pac-12 went to 9 conference games. Just you're taking away opportunities. And I do wonder about the playoff expansion piece in this, because if they're actually able to incentivize good scheduling, like if they say, if you lose 2 or 3 games, but they're 2 good teams, we're not going to ding you too much, you can still make the playoff. Then you're going to see lots of people, like we've seen a lot of home and homes already scheduled for like post 2025. I think you're going to see more of that. But that does become the question, like, is this just kind of that upper level of football kind of essentially breaking off from everybody else? Or do you care about those types of games and the health of the rest of the sport and these other athletic departments? Because financially, a lot of this stuff doesn't make a ton of sense. And like the way college sports is set up doesn't make a ton of sense. Like football and basketball like subsidize everything else. The tournament subsidizes everything else for like all these other schools. Yep. Does that stuff matter to you? Like, does the idea of spreading the wealth matter? Or are you going to just be looking out for your schools from a scheduling standpoint? People are worried about declining attendance, your TV revenue, all these things. Like, does that take over instead of, again, scheduling the directional schools in your state to help those athletic departments? Like these are kind of those existential questions that I think people are going to have to answer about, like, what do they want college football to look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Like that is like one of the fundamental questions about financially, how do they want it to work? And do you want to be under the same umbrella, even if it's a subdivision difference,
right,
as App State? Well, now they're in the Sun Belt, but as Delaware and as those schools, do you want to be in a situation where you are spreading the wealth when you're even scheduling those teams? Like they're fundamentally going to have to think about if they want that to be part of the model.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of change coming in this landscape, and a lot of it's driven by the finances, like you mentioned. So I'm very curious. I want to get you out of here on this. Just your general thoughts on the Big Ten. Who do you see having standout seasons? Some players to look out for. I know that you're big on some of the personalities that exist in the conference. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another year where it's Ohio State and we wait for someone else to close the gap. I think, my alma mater, Christian school, like these are the schools we've been waiting. And every time you see the game get played, it's like, here's still that gap. And, obviously things are tense with Jim Harbaugh and, what is a level of success that would be enough for Michigan fans. Again, it's beating Ohio State. It's competing for Big Ten championships, and they haven't really been able to do that. Does Cade McNamara, like, can he hit on a quarterback? Like, that's just an overall standpoint. Wisconsin, I'm interested to see. Graham Mertz, I'm interested to see the receiving core this year, if they can actually get a vertical passing game going. Mm-hmm. I love Indiana. I think it's wild to think that they have high expectations and possibly could only disappoint us. Like, we're in a world where we think so highly of Indiana football. So I think there's a lot. And I think, too, the Penn State question is really interesting. 5th offensive coordinator in the James Franklin era. What does that look like for Sean Clifford for his 4th OC? What does that offense look like? But really, like, it's about somebody figuring out a way to close the gap on Ohio State. And it's not even really a Big Ten problem, even though we see it every year. But like, there's just Clemson, Alabama, and Ohio State are at a level that no one else is at. So it's like, it's just so hard to close that, and they don't get down. They just reload. Like, that's why we're talking about CJ Stroud and being like, he's going to be great, even though he hasn't thrown a pass in college. Right. Why would we doubt him based on everything we've seen of the Ryan Day era, even from the Urban Meyer era? So I think that's overall, what I'm looking at. And I think there's going to be great stories. Again, if Indiana stays relevant, that's going to be really interesting. Rutgers, 20 minutes from where I grew up, always have a soft spot for them. Can they take that next
first
step?
Game is sold out.
Sold out. There's a lot of positive momentum recruiting for Greg Schiano and company. So yeah, it's just, there's a lot of little stuff, but the big picture is just, are Penn State and Michigan particularly, maybe we can have the conversation about Wisconsin or somebody in the West, but can they close the gap on Ohio State? And if not, what is the plan to do that? And, it's just really hard right now.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch. I appreciate you spending some time with us. Definitely have some fun. We'll catch up, obviously, on the Big Ten Network some weekends in Chicago, but looking forward to your work this fall.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Honored to be the first guest.
There we go. Thank you.